What's my favorite day of the week? And not just because it's the end of the week, it's because it's Friday. That means it's the mailbag day here on the Morning Pit. We got a lot of great questions, basketball stuff, transfer stuff, recruiting stuff, football stuff, offensive coordinator stuff, all kinds of stuff. And we're going to talk about it right here on the Morning Pit on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. That's right. It's a mailbag edition of the Morning Pit on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. It's what we do every Friday right here on the Morning Pit. We take your questions on Panther-Lair.com, the Between Fifth and Forbes message board. People have been posting questions for the last few days, and we answer as many of them as we can right here on the Friday edition of the Morning Pit. I always look forward to it. It's always fun to do because, I mean, let's be honest. You guys get to pick the topics. You take like half the work out of it for me. Sometimes I spend more time trying to figure out a topic and what to say about it and researching it and this and that than actually recording these videos. The videos take like 20 minutes, right? Plus, editing time and processing time and, uploading and all that stuff. Let's say I invest 30, 35 minutes or whatever in putting the whole thing together. There's a bunch of time, just as much time, if not more, that goes into like preparing for it. And find, sketching out what I want to talk about and how I'm going to talk about it and any research or stats I might need. But the mailbag, man, you guys just ask questions. I glance over them before I sit down and then we just roll. Sometimes I even want to do it blind and not even look at the questions, but I do like to look and make sure that we have enough questions to get us through the 20 or 25 minutes. So I do tend to look at it ahead of time, and I know that we have some great questions. We're actually going to start with a couple questions from last week, and then we'll move into all the questions from this week. But, of course, what we ask you to do right here is like this video and subscribe, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com, and head over and check out the website, Panther-Lair.com, Pittsburgh.rivals.com. That way you don't miss any Pitt sports coverage. We got a lot of stuff on the offensive coordinator search. We got a lot of stuff on transfers and recruiting and everything going on. Not to mention coverage of the basketball team as they host Canisius tomorrow night. Finally get a break from these power conference opponents. Certainly did a nice job against West Virginia on Wednesday night. We can say what we want about the state of West Virginia's basketball team this season, but the reality is Pitt beat them up pretty good and looked pretty good doing it. They should be able to match that or exceed it against Canisius tomorrow night. But mailbag, and actually our first mailbag question is about basketball. This comes from last week. This is one of the leftovers. Yuli's92 says, can we get the full story of what happened with Dior Johnson's late exit? And why did this team decide to not repeat the formula that worked last year, relying on multiple veteran transfer guards, Cummings, Elliott, Burton, and Sabandi? I'll just keep going because I'd like to know the plan at guard this year. It's a long season, injuries, foul trouble, off nights. Do we really only have 3 players, 2 freshmen we rely on in big games? If yes, should we play bigger with only 1 guard then? Leggett, Carrington, and Lowe all had great moments thus far, but they have been up and down. In both games they were down. It felt like we had no chance of clinching the win at the end of the game. Like after the hints and triples, I figured that we'd at least have a competitive end of the game. So Yuli's, this question was from last week. I think it's kind of funny. Like, I think he's talking about the Missouri game, but really could have applied to the Clemson game, which hadn't happened yet when this question was posted. But let's start the full story of the Dior Johnson late exit. I mean, I think it was a situation where he had his incident. The ruling was that he was done as a student at the University of Pittsburgh, not just student athlete, but student. I think he appealed it. And a lot of this is based on Noah Heil's reporting. He did a great job sort of sourcing this story out and getting the details on the conduct policy of the university. I think he appealed it, and that got him sort of reinstated. And when a ruling was finally issued in late summer, the appeal was denied. That's sort of how I understand it. I could have some of the details wrong, but I think that's what it came down to. That the university kicked him out. As to the rest of the question, why did this team decide to not repeat the formula that worked last year? And we talked a lot, I think, in the offseason about the efforts to pursue veteran guards, to try and bring in transfer guards, kind of like they did with Nelly Cummings and Jamarius Burton and Greg Elliott. Obviously, that worked to a lot of success last year. Why didn't they do it this year? They tried. I mean, you saw the Clemson game, you saw Joe Girard, right? I mean, they tried to get Joe Girard. They tried to get a number of veteran guards, but they just weren't successful in landing them outside of Ishmael Leggett. And part of the reason, as it was suggested to me, and I think we saw this, and it was said on the record and off the record, and I think, the proof was in the pudding. The results were right there that, you brought in 2 high-level freshman guards in Bub Carrington and Jalen Lowe. And at the time when you were trying to bring in veteran transfers, you also had Dior Johnson projected to come back. And Dior Johnson's a guy that a lot of people know about. And I would say this throughout the spring, and people be like, nobody's scared of Dior Johnson. Maybe not. But most of the guys that you were trying to get, a guy like a Joe Girard or somebody, I mean, they know who he is. They know who Dior Johnson is. They know of his reputation. And so they're likely looking at it and saying, Coach, you got a couple of really good freshmen coming in. You've got Dior Johnson there. Where are my minutes going to come from? How am I going to play? Where am I going to get on the court? Because I'm not coming in to – I don't want to come in to be the guy who plays 11 minutes off the bench. I mean, I'm coming in for a primary role, a featured role as a starter. How are you going to guarantee me that? How are you going to give me those minutes? And Jeff Capel could sell it any way he wants, and Milan Brown and Jason Capel and Tim O'Toole, all these guys could work as hard as they could to convince transfer guards that they're going to have a role. But the reality is, the kids are looking at that situation, and they're looking at other situations where maybe they have a better shot or a more clear, direct path, and they're saying, I'm going to go with that. So I think they wanted veteran guards, because who wouldn't? But I think it was very difficult to recruit given what their roster looked like. Now, you take Dior Johnson out of the mix, and now you're thin because, as you said, you have three guards. I mean, you have Bub Carrington, Jalen Lowe, and Ish Leggett among the scholarship roster. And so it's funny, you ask, like, could we end up seeing them go with a lineup with one guard? And it's funny because in the West Virginia game on Wednesday night, Ish Leggett picks up that technical foul really early. He gets his second foul 3 minutes into the first half, and they don't bring in Jalen Lowe. They bring in Jorge Diaz-Graham, and your lineup was Bub Carrington with Jorge Diaz-Graham, Zach Austin, Blake Hinson, and Federico. And the next sub, about a minute and a half later, was Guillermo Diaz-Graham in for Federico. Jalen Lowe didn't come in to that game until less than 7 minutes to go in the first half. So they pretty much had one guard the whole way. Because, that first lineup sub, you ended up with Carrington, Jorge, Zach Austin, Blake Hinson, and Federico. The next sub, you replace Federico with Guillermo. So you've got both Diaz-Graham twins plus Austin, Hinson, and Carrington. The next sub, Austin comes out and Will Jeffress comes in. So you've got Bub with Jorge, Guillermo, Blake, and Will Jeffress. And then the next sub, Federico and Austin come back in. So, again, I texted our other Panther-Lair guys. I'm like, who's the two in this lineup? Where you've got Bub Carrington, Blake Hinson, Zach Austin, Will Jeffress, and Federico. Who's the two guard? I guess it's Blake Hinson. I guess Blake Hinson was playing a two guard in that lineup. Now, after that, they subbed in Jalen Lowe finally with less than 7 minutes to go in the first half, but they subbed him for Carrington, so you still ended up with the same kind of lineup. So, yeah, they're doing that. Now, that's the first time I've seen them do it. I haven't really seen them experiment with a one-guard lineup all that much. We've seen three-guard lineups. We've seen Carrington, Leggett, and Lowe play together. Not every game, but we've seen them play together. But I haven't seen that one-guard lineup just yet, but we saw that on Wednesday night, and it was unique, and I don't know if it was just a matchup thing with West Virginia or if we'll see more of it tomorrow night, but it'll be interesting to watch for. And I think your point is right. I mean, there are going to be situations where you might need to do that again, so they probably might want to look into playing that a little bit more against Canisius just to get it worked out, to get comfortable on the court with either Blake or Jorge or whoever was playing the two in that set. Get those guys out there. But good question there. Pitman 2003 says, what happened with DeAndre Jules? Him leaving is a significant loss. Overall, how much of our losses to the portal are from players looking for better NIL deals? So this question was, another one from last week. DeAndre Jules is a big loss. I had the episode yesterday where I talked about portal needs and what Pitt needs to get out of the transfer portal, and defensive tackle is a big spot because with Jules gone, in addition to the three super seniors, Danielson, Bentley, and Green, they don't have a whole lot left. I mean, they return Elliott Donald, Sean Fitzsimmons, and Isaiah Neal. That's not much. That's a very, very thin rotation at defensive tackle. And so losing Jules, who is pretty much guaranteed a starting job and a primary role at defensive tackle, it's huge. That is a huge blow to Pitt's defensive tackle lineup and rotation. So it's a big loss. And what happened? I think it's NIL related. I think he wanted a better opportunity for NIL, and I think that was the same case with Sam Okunlola. Now, if you look at guys they've lost, I mean, I think those are the two biggest losses so far. Hopefully nobody else has gone into the portal. Nobody else of note has gone into the portals, by the time you watch this video. But I think those are the two primary losses so far. And I think both are NIL related. I think Pitt has been pretty. There's another question that we'll get to in a second about Pitt's NIL operations. And I think Pitt has been competitive with NIL. I think you see some of the guys who have decided to come back who probably could have gotten good opportunities NIL-wise in the transfer portal, and they decide to come back. And I think that's a testament to the NIL operation that's at Pitt or on Pitt's behalf, however you want to term it. But you're not going to keep everybody every year. You're going to lose guys that you want to hold on to every season. I think every team in the country is losing guys that they would rather hold on to, and Pitt is not immune to that. I think they've been able to minimize it, though. So I think they've done a good job with that so far. And El Salvador, the last question from last week says, will Pitt have a new offensive coordinator by December 4th? If yes, whom? Well, El Salvador, today's December 8th. So, yeah. Let's move over to questions from this week. Here, I want to bring this up, see where we're at with this week's questions. Here we go. Static, our friend Stas7ick is, I guess I would pronounce it, but I always just sort of refer you to as Static in my head. What are your thoughts on the NCAA's proposed structure and how it would affect Pitt? And I talked about this on Wednesday's Morning Pitt. I don't know. Because the idea from the NCAA is to create a subdivision that teams could opt into if they want to sort of create their own rules and truly move closer to autonomy for teams that want to move into it, and schools that want, I shouldn't even say teams, schools that want to move into it. And for those schools, they would be able to give a minimum. They're not calling it a salary, but it's effectively a salary. It's like a payout from a trust, $30,000 a year minimum to at least half of the eligible student athletes at your school. You could do away with scholarship limits. There's a number of sort of autonomous regulations that would be available to these schools who want to opt into this subdivision. And what I've said is I feel like it's the NCAA trying to keep the SEC and Big Ten in the fold, because they probably feel like, and rightly so, that the SEC and Big Ten are going to try to form their own thing anyway with these rule changes. It seems highly likely to me that that's what those two conferences are aiming for. And so I think the NCAA is trying to say, no, look, guys, we'll give you an opportunity to do it here. You can still be part of the NCAA and not take away all that money that we're getting from you and the money that you generate for us. You don't have to leave. You can stay right here and we'll do it too. That's sort of what I take that to be. Could be wrong about it. It's far more interesting to me, what your question is how that affects Pitt. And you could insert the names of like 70 other FBS schools into this question of how does it affect them, or maybe 80 other FBS schools. There's a whole bunch of schools, basically the entire G5, and like 40 or 45 of the Power 5 schools who are going to have to ask themselves this question of like, what's really the move for us here? What makes sense for us here? Does it make sense for us to opt into a subdivision that has this kind of unlimited spending? Or does it make sense for us to pursue other avenues and maybe find some sort of strength in numbers with a bunch of other schools who say we don't want to be a part of that and sort of create their own thing? And I don't know. I mean, my guess is that Pitt is going to try and push to keep up with everybody else. That's sort of the standard they've set for themselves, that they're going to keep trying to keep up with everybody else. Whether they make it or not, they're going to keep trying to keep up with everybody else. Whether it spends them into oblivion, they're going to keep trying to keep up with everybody else. And, we'll see. I don't know. If the NCAA does that, I think Pitt will try, and I'm sure the fans would want them to try to move into it, but I don't know. I don't know if it makes the most sense, and I don't know what they would do. So, sorry, I don't have an answer to that. I don't really have an answer to this next question either. Thunder Pit Road says, Chris, to your knowledge, how involved, if at all, has Heather Lyke been in the new offensive coordinator search? Did she have a conversation with Pat Narduzzi after the regular season and make clear that it was necessary to go in a different direction with his offensive philosophy, or was she more hands-off as has been more typical? I don't have an answer to that. All I can base it on is sort of general conversations I've had, what you said, what has been typical, how things have generally gone over the past years that Heather Lyke has been at Pitt. And just sort of my general read on the situation is that it makes sense for her to let Narduzzi make the hire. It just does on a lot of levels. For one, she's been hands-off. She has not forced coaching changes, assistant coaching changes, or coordinator changes. She has not forced one of her coaches to hire a certain coach. She hasn't done those things. She holds the head coach accountable for the success or failures of the program, and the head coach has to make the decisions that he or she feels will make the program stronger. And so if Pat Narduzzi felt like he needed to fire Frank Cignetti, then it was on him to fire Frank Cignetti. If Heather Lyke felt like Pat Narduzzi should fire Frank Cignetti, she might communicate that to him, but I don't think she would issue an ultimatum or a demand or anything like that. If Heather Lyke believes that, the best offensive coordinator option is Coach A, she may communicate that to Pat Narduzzi. I think she's involved and in communication about these things, but she would not. I don't think she's going to demand that he hires anyone or insist upon him hiring anyone. She might communicate her thoughts, but the hire is Narduzzi's, and I think she'll support it, whoever he wants to hire. And as I've said before, look, if you're the athletic director, I think you have to let your head coach make those hires, because if you intervene, right, if you step in and say, no, you have to hire this guy. You need to hire Matt Canada back. You need to go hire this guy or go hire that guy. Well, now you're on the hook for it too. It's now you're now sort of responsible for it as well. I think you let your head coach run the program so the head coach can be evaluated on the overall state of the program. And if you meddle too much, if you insist on hiring a new offensive coordinator or hiring a specific offensive coordinator, and that guy falls flat on his face, now it's on you too. So I think and I think a good executive would do this, and I think most executives would do this. I think you remove yourself, you keep yourself at arm's length. You offer input, particularly if it's requested. You are certainly aware and maybe even sit in on the interviews. I don't think that would be out of line because you should know who's getting hired, but ultimately it's got to be his call. And that's the approach Heather Lyke has taken, and I think that's the approach she'll continue to take. I think it's the approach she took in this instance. Atwood409 says, am I a big stupid dummy for thinking that Pitt's NIL situation is pretty good? And given that and the culture, maybe Pitt isn't doing that much worse than many of their peers. I don't entirely disagree. I really don't. I think Pitt is facing an uphill battle with NIL. I think Pitt has a lot of challenges with NIL. I think Pitt is behind a lot of its peers in NIL. And I mean, we can loosely define peers. I mean, I don't know if it's behind a lot of the schools on the same tier, but in terms of overall Power 5 in college football, I think they're behind a lot of schools in NIL efforts and NIL success. But kind of like I alluded to earlier, I mean, if you look at losing DeAndre Jules and Sam Okunlola, that's 2 out. And then you can pretty much you can look at Gavin Bartholomew, Rodney Hammond, Deion Hayes, Branson Taylor, Ryan Baer. Solomon DeShields announced yesterday that he's going to return. And what I keep saying is if a guy announces that he's returning, put another way, a guy wouldn't announce that he's returning if he wasn't considering leaving in the first place. You know what I mean? Like if you announce that you're returning, it means that you were considering the possibility of not doing so. And so to me, that means, I'm looking at that and saying, okay, NIL efforts were made and were apparently successful to bring those 6 guys back. So if you have 6 instances of retention of players you really wanted to keep, good players, important players, and only 2 instances of loss of players that you wanted to keep, good players, important players, then you're coming out ahead. You're +4, right? 6 kept, 2 lost. I'm guessing both of those numbers will go up, and then we start getting into the acquisition side of things, which is going to be important as well. But you really have to evaluate it on all 3 of those elements: losses, retention, acquisition. And so far, with the acquisition part very much a TBD, so far I think Pitt's in good shape. I think they're doing really well. Gayasuda Ganak says, who's the new OC? I don't know. He says, what coaches, if any, is he bringing with him? I don't know. Says, what players, if any, is he bringing with him? I don't know. Let's see. This is a good question. DK16,000 says, how do college football players assess their market value before deciding to go into the portal? Do they first go to their existing school and request an offer to stay? So this is an interesting question, and I think it's a very important topic when we talk about NIL as it relates to the transfer portal, as it relates to the decision to go into the transfer portal, and just on this whole thing. And one of the biggest issues that coaches have brought up, and rightfully so, and Pat Narduzzi has talked about this and other coaches have as well, is that there's just no transparency in NIL deals. You know what I mean? There's none. And so, Scott Boras, right, can walk into a general manager's office with loads of data and information about the player performance and how that compares to other players, similar positions, and then what, the compensation from those players and how that equates to what his client should get. A college football player and his representative can walk in with some information about their performance and their stats and their ability, but there's no comparison points whatsoever because there's no transparency and there's no accountability in these NIL offers and NIL deals. You can't find a database of NIL offers that have been registered and recorded. I think the schools have these have this information, because all these guys who get NIL deals have to file paperwork with schools and with compliance. And so the schools, I think, have those records, but it's not public and it's not available in a database, or it's not in a database that's available to coaches or student athletes to access. And so there's none of that. All there is word of mouth. Like, hey, I'm an offensive lineman at one school. You're an offensive lineman at another school. Yo, I just got a deal that's giving me $10,000 a month. Wow. Holy cow. Yo, so-and-so just told me he got a deal of $10,000 a month. Can you believe that? That's like, $120,000 a year or something, or $80,000. I forget if it includes this. Let's just say it includes all 12 months. That's like $120,000. Wow. Yo, did you hear? I just heard this guy is getting $120,000 a year. Can you believe that? Yeah, they're probably even throwing in a car or something. Yo, I just heard this guy is getting like over $100,000. He's getting a car. And he might even get like $10,000 a month on top of that or something. And so you end up with this game of telephone. All right. And like, I'm not exaggerating when they say that this happens. And then, way down the line, player Z goes to his school's collective, and he's like, listen, I heard this guy is getting this, and I think this is what I deserve too. And nobody has any way to prove it. Nobody has any way to hold it accountable. There's no transparency in it whatsoever. And so, and nobody has any idea. Well, does that seem like a fair number? I don't know. You can only really sort of compare it within your, within your team, this other guy is getting this, or this other guy is getting that. And the number of times you talk to people about NIL stuff and you hear the phrase, well, I'm hearing that. It's all I'm hearing that. Nobody actually knows anything unless it's something they've been specifically and directly involved with. And so how do players assess their market value? For lack of a better way of saying it, they make it up. Or their representative makes it up. And like, this is part of the problem. And, so when coaches say it's the wild, wild west, they're not just trying to paint it as some lawless, frontier where anything goes. They're not just trying to portray it as free agency where everything's totally out of control. They're pointing out that it really is unregulated. There's no regulations to this thing, and that's a big part of the problem. I think that's a big part of the reason that coaches have an issue with it, is because they just need a little bit more regulation. And it's not there right now. It's not. And so that's something that has to be addressed and corrected, but it's not happening. So that's something to keep in mind when you start reading about these deals and things like that. And then just a final thought. I mean, these aren't contracts, and so guys could sometimes be lured to a place with an NIL promise, and then the money doesn't get paid out. You see guys leaving Texas A&M in droves, and some of them, as they're going out the door, are saying, "And I never got anything I was promised to get." There's rumors about Jordan Addison at USC not getting what he was promised to get. This is probably, I mean, if there's a single biggest problem with NIL, it's that. Is that there's no transparency, no accountability, no market value to speak of. And it's just all wild numbers, some of it imaginary. All right, I think that's good for us today. Those are great questions. We got more questions that are locked and loaded in there, and we'll get to as many as we can next week. But I appreciate everybody who submitted questions for the mailbag. It's been a lot of fun. I really appreciate that, and we certainly always have a good time with the Morning Pitt Mailbag here on Fridays. We enjoy that for sure. Quick shout out to the Pitt volleyball team. The Panthers moving on to the Elite Eight for that rematch with Louisville tomorrow. You're excited about Pitt Canisius tomorrow night. Pitt Louisville is going to be jumping at the Fitzgerald Fieldhouse tomorrow afternoon. That's going to be a fun one, a wild one. Certainly looking forward to it tomorrow. Good luck to Pitt trying to make another return appearance to the Final Four. So thanks for tuning in today. Thanks everybody who submitted questions. Thanks for watching the Morning Pit all week. It's been a lot of fun, as it always is. I hope you've had a great week, and I hope you have a great weekend. We will talk to you on Monday for the Morning Pit, right here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com.